I'm Donnie Da Silva, and I'm stoked to introduce this week's guest. I first became aware of him when I read about him in a wrestling magazine that did a feature on this new voice working for AWA. And like most school-age kids, I didn't think much about him at the time because, let's face it, in those days, announcers were just announcers. They weren't ever really part of the story. They were just there to move the story along. In 1991, he made the move to WCW after the AWA had permanently shuttered, and he started out as an announcer once again, and just 2 years later was promoted to executive producer. A year after that, he was again promoted to senior vice president, effectively becoming the head man in charge of World Championship Wrestling. His accomplishments during that time are almost an embarrassment of riches, but topping the list would be his decision to air weekly pro wrestling live to air, the development and popularization of the cruiserweight division, and of course, the New World Order. The NWO changed the industry forever. And let's not forget, he came within a caterpillar's hair of putting WWE out of business once and for all. After WCW was purchased by its chief competitor, the unthinkable happened, and he joined WWE as an on-screen character. That run lasted for several years before he popped up once again in TNA Wrestling, initially hired just to manage the creative for his longtime friend Hulk Hogan. He helped usher in a brand new era for that company, although he has previously stated that that run was regrettable. Over the last few years, he has made sporadic appearances for WWE and AEW and can now be heard every week on his podcast, 83 Weeks, and my personal favorite, Wise Choices. Ladies and gentlemen, he's a television producer, creative head, broadcaster, author, husband, and father. And if you played a game of Family Feud, surveyed 100 people, and asked who are the most polarizing names in pro wrestling history, he'd make the board. This is Eric Bischoff. Hello, sir.
Hey, thank you very much. That was a hell of an intro, but it's probably the fact that I'm polarizing is probably one of the bigger compliments I could get, because I think we all have become so damn soft. We're soft, we're mushy. The truth scares us to death, whether it's politics, whether it's sports, whether it's professional wrestling. Everybody is so fragile and soft that the truth actually leaves scars. Not me. I'm all about it.
It's funny how in the world of professional wrestling, there are so many people today that are afraid of heat, right? There are people that just don't want to touch. No, I don't want to say that. I don't want to get heat. And you have this old school mindset of bring it on, baby. Let's rock.
One of my favorite shirts, when we do, whether it's the podcast 83 Weeks, where you can get anywhere you get your favorite podcast, or whether it's Wise Choices, which you can only find on YouTube over at 83weeks.com. It'll take you right to our YouTube page. A lot of stuff going on there. But yeah, it's crazy the amount of feedback I get just by making, and it's not just, wrestling fans. Dax Harwood at AEW, one of the softest, mushiest, most marshmallow-minded muckerfuthers I've ever seen in prime time. Like, he just whines and cries like a 2-year-old child if he sees criticism. So, hey, I'm here for it, man. I'm all about creating emotion.
What did you call him on Twitter last week? A chunky monkey?
Chunky monkey, because he is a fat little guy, right?
Oh my God.
I get it. I think his idol is, well, it depends on the day, but either Bret Hart or Arn Anderson. And Arn Anderson, he had a look, but he also came along at a point in time where you didn't have to have that ripped physique. Arn was a big guy. He didn't need a ripped physique to impose his will or make you believe that he could if he chose to. Dax, on the other hand, is just kind of just mushy, just chunky and mushy, mentally and physically. He needs to work on that. If you want to be a star, you got to look like a star, muckerfather. You can't just walk around looking like the Michelin tire guy and expect people to believe in your character.
I definitely do want to dive deeper into the aesthetic of a pro wrestler and how that's changed over the years. But before I get there, and before I even dive too much into your career, there's something that you talk about a lot on your podcast, whether it's 83 Weeks or Wise Choices, which, by the way, I'm a huge fan of both. There's something that you talk about a lot that I often end up in discussions with people in the business or even fans, and they seem to have trouble wrapping their head around it, Eric. And I'm hoping we can have a chat about it. And that is the way that you break down the components and mechanics of a story, and specifically a story within professional wrestling. I think a lot of people, both in the industry and spectators, have trouble understanding the difference between an angle that is abruptly shot to justify a match and then is never revisited again, and a story. And you have this whole formula that you've developed, which I think is genius. And I just want you to talk to that a little bit, and then we can dive in on it.
Well, I appreciate that. And it's not so much a formula that I developed. In fact, it's something that I read about, I study, I think about when I'm watching other television programming, whether it's a scripted drama or even a comedy, certainly in feature films. There's a book called The Hero's Journey, written by a guy by the name of Joseph Campbell. It's been around for a long time. And I'm not here to pitch that book necessarily, but I do think that people in the industry, talent and producers especially, writers especially, should spend some time reading that book. You don't have to study the whole thing, right? Because it covers the basic elements of a story structure, the beginning, the middle, and the end. That's something that everybody's at least heard of, even though they don't really think about how to apply it necessarily to wrestling. But whether it's a book, whether it's a feature film, whether it's a television show, whether it's a commercial that you see, for someone trying to sell a product, they all have a beginning and a middle and an end. Everything has a formula. Good comedy has a formula. I've read about and listened to a lot of interviews from stand-up comics who talk about the process of creating, their list, right? Or their set is how they refer to it, and how they create their jokes. And there's a formula to everything. And there's a formula to good professional wrestling storytelling. And you're right. I mean, you said it. An angle is nothing but a justification for a dream match. I want to put this guy against this guy. Oh, okay, well, let's have him, call his mom a name or something stupid. Or it could be more intense, right? Just shoot an angle. And that angle is what they think, and when I say they, I'm specifically talking about Tony Khan and company over at AEW. They think that, the audience is going to just engage because of an angle, and they don't. They engage because they're on a journey. They engage because there's plot points along the way. If you look at a story arc from the beginning to the middle to the end, along the way in those three areas, there are plot points that are really required if you want the audience to engage in the story and go for that ride with you, so that the physical narrative of a wrestling match is the payoff. And in AEW's case, the physicality is the only thing there is. I mean, I was making a joke about Dax Harwood and how soft and mushy he is mentally and physically. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, they announced that he's going to be wrestling tomorrow night. This is Tuesday as we're recording this. So tomorrow night, Wednesday, here in the States, Dynamite is going to have a match between, I think it's Okada and Dax Harwood. And immediately Dax says, I can't wait for some paid-for podcasters who cry about the fact that there's no story. Well, there's no story. And yes, it will be a interesting match for those people whose only interest is the technical wrestling aspect of it, the action in the ring. Those people are probably going to, be as happy as they can be because they're going to get that. Unfortunately, that part of the audience represents about 20% of the audience. The other 80% are going to go, I'm not watching this. There's no reason to watch it. There's no engagement. There's no connection. There's no journey. There's no emotion. There's no anything other than a dream match. And it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. But if you read the book, Joseph Campbell's book, in fact, I think George Lucas, I think that book, Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero's Journey, don't quote me on this because it's been a while since I read it, but was kind of the inspiration, if you will, for the original Star Wars trilogy. It helped Lucas conceptualize the journey. And if you read that book, you could probably spend 2 hours reading that book. Just read the first chapter or two of that book. And if you walk away from it, put it down, walk away from it, and think about, okay, most of this applies to feature films, television, plays, Broadway plays, theater. But how do I take the elements that work in those other forms of entertainment and apply them to professional wrestling? Because you can, and they work. And I don't know what the process is, for example, in WWE. I have friends there, but I don't talk to my friends about their work in WWE. When we talk about our kids or family, travel, whatever, but I don't talk about the process. But I can assure you, without even knowing and having been in that environment, that there is significant emphasis put on the story arc, making sure that the right beats happen at the right time along the way to give you the best odds of success. It doesn't mean it's going to work every time. It doesn't. Nothing will. That's why writers and directors and producers oftentimes, have bombs, because you think you're doing it and you think you've checked all the boxes and you find out, it just really wasn't that compelling. Another word that probably doesn't exist in the vocabulary of many people in AEW, because that shoot an angle, have a match formula is just not compelling, with the exception of that small, very small group of people, which is why their audience has been deteriorating and hasn't grown.
I think it's interesting when people see one paper-thin piece of motivation and they think that that's enough to justify a story. And my other big pet peeve that I have right now, and I hate to pick on them, Eric, but it does happen a lot with the AEW fan base, is when something comes up that you can tell is complete happenstance, completely accidental, and they'll scream, look, see, long-term storytelling. Because like they're doing it right now, right? With the angle that's going on between Swerve and Christian Cage. And they say, oh, see, Christian Cage mentioned that Swerve was the guy who beat up his son last summer. It's like, y'all were working together. You, in storyline, hired him for that job. And this is not long-term storytelling. This is happenstance that someone just squished into the promo to try and
it's like desperation writing.
Yeah,
it's creative by desperation only. It's sad. Well, it's not sad. It's funny. I find it hilarious. I know I spend too much time on social media, particularly when I'm traveling, because I got nothing else to do. And a couple of weeks ago, I had to fly to Australia. I didn't have to. I chose to, and it was a blessing to be able to do that over there, make an appearance and all that. But I'm on a plane for 19 hours. I got Wi-Fi and a cocktail. Guess what? I'm going to have some fun.
Yeah.
And, pissing off AEW fans that are really the most low information, low hanging fruit fan base I've ever experienced in my life is kind of fun for me. I actually enjoy it, stirring it up. But you're absolutely right. They'll grab her and see, they're actually doing it. No, they're not. You want them to do it so bad. It's kind of like when you're in the desert and your horse dies and you're out there and you're dying of thirst. Your horse is laying there dead. The vultures are coming for your horse. You're dying of thirst. You're dehydrated. You're starting to freaking hallucinate. And then you look out over the desert as you're slowly dying. You're going to be right there with a horse in about an hour and a half or 2 hours. And you look out and, oh my gosh. There's water. There's a lake. There's palm trees. There's hot chicks in bikinis. Like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. But it's not real. It's a fantasy. It's a figment of your imagination because of the desperation of the fact that you're dying slowly. See a lot of parallels there.
There's a I'm sure you'll appreciate this. There's a Canadian rock band who I'm sure you're not familiar with. That's okay. They're called Sloan, and they have a song that they put out in the late 90s called Coax Me. And one of the lyrics in that song, you're going to like this, I think, is something that always pops in my head when I think about this fan base. And the lyric is, "It's not the band I hate, it's their fans."
Well, and I'll tell you what, this is another, layer of all things wrong with AEW currently. But one of the other things that fascinates me is how, and it all starts at the top. Tony Khan is a whiny little bitch. When somebody criticizes him or somebody comes out and points out something, oh my gosh, the tribalism. AEW is constantly under attack. To be AEW is to be under attack. He's constantly whining like a little girl. But at the same time, he's the first one from the beginning of AEW. They're like throwing hand grenades over across the pond to AEW, across the state to or WWE. They're taking shots every time, from Tony to the talent on down. As recently as a week ago, they're constantly taking shots at WWE. But yet, the minute anybody points out an obvious flaw, because there's so many to choose from in AEW, they're saying, oh my, the tribalism, oh, the haters, oh. I mean, they're creating the tribalism that they actually whine about. And the head of it all is Dave Meltzer. Dave Meltzer tries so hard to support AEW while making it look like he's an actual journalist and he's unbiased. He thinks he's good at it, but anybody can see through it, and more people are now. And I think a lot of the anti-AEW rhetoric that's out there in social media is largely because Dave Meltzer creates it. I mean, he's constantly trying to make it look like AEW is far more successful than it is. And as a result, people like me point out the flaws. Right. And point out how Dave is full of shit. Can I swear on this show? I forgot to ask. I usually ask.
Producer's gonna have to edit it. Yeah, they don't like swearing on terrestrial radio.
I'll be more careful.
It's okay.
My point is, they're creating the anti-AEW rhetoric that they're whining about, and they're not smart enough. I mean, intellectually smart enough to figure it out.
Right.
And that's why 2 years ago I said, Tony Khan, shut up and wrestle. Quit throwing hand grenades at WWE. Quit putting them down. Quit comparing yourself to them. Just put out a great product. And we're seeing the results of him not listening to that free advice.
A lot of people want to point to Tony Khan as being the head of this tribalistic divide within fan bases. But I think there's a lot of merit to what you just said, because I think Tony, all of his wrestling acumen comes from Dave Meltzer, comes from being a fan and reading The Observer. And I feel like when Dave says, oh, that was a 6-star match, and that was this, and that was that, he really seems to process in his head, we're doing no wrong, and we don't need to fix anything. And anyone who says otherwise is hating on us. And Dave gets a lot of the same criticism that you've been getting lately, right? Because there are people within AEW and fans that say, oh, Eric Bischoff, he's on the payroll for WWE. That's why he says all these things. And then, of course, there's people that say that about Dave, that he's on Tony Khan's payroll. And I don't think that's the case. But when I look at some of the things Dave even just said recently, last week he made a comment, Eric, where he said WWE Backlash had the lowest pay-per-view buys in WWE history. But he neglects to mention they don't use a pay-per-view model anymore. And then yesterday he put out a comment saying WWE Raw has only sold 7,500 tickets. The hot streak has ended. And then I did a quick Google search and saw that the venue was set up for 8,500 and it was sold out. So I'm really confused by this. Like, it feels like an attempt to just discredit what is currently the hottest period in the company's history.
And again, here's my thesis on that. I like you, I don't believe that Dave Meltzer is being paid by AEW. I don't. Not saying it's impossible or whatever, but I just don't believe that that's true. What I believe 100% to be true, because I've known Dave for over 30 years. Dave's been doing the same shtick for over 30 years. Mm-hmm. So I've seen the patterns and the way he operates and the way he communicates and the way he reports and what he reports. I've been watching it for 30 years. This isn't anything new for me. Dave has never done anything professionally outside of writing a dirt sheet. He, whether he'll admit it or not, thinks that he knows how to book, how to write, how to produce professional wrestling. And people like me in WWE have always looked at him, and to a degree, does he have his finger on the pulse of a certain percentage of the fan base? Yeah, probably. You know, he's got his own little community on his dirt sheet universe. But he doesn't have any experience. He's never done it. He just has an idea because he's been a super fan for 30 years. That's all he is a super fan. And by virtue of the fact that he's been watching and writing and talking about it for 30 years, he thinks he has the knowledge. Tony Khan comes along with $1 billion of daddy's money or whatever it is, and decides he wants to. Now, these two, to your point, and I agree with you 100%, these two are like symbiotic in many, many ways. They think the same. They view wrestling the same. The things that excite them are the same. But Tony doesn't have any more experience. He has a little bit more now. Unfortunately, it's a horrible experience. But Tony doesn't have any more experience than Dave does. When Tony launched, he launched with his daddy's money because he's a super fan. He grew up watching ECW, and he just got all excited about that. And now he has an opportunity to go out and have his own wrestling company, and he's doing the things that excite him and are consistent with the way he thinks, based on his limited, if any, experience, successful experience, is what wrestling should be in order to be successful. Dave looks at Tony like a meal ticket, not a financial meal ticket, but finally somebody agrees with me and is doing the things that I've been talking about all this time. And now it's not working out so well, which is why his tweets and the things that he's posting and writing about it become so transparently insane. I mean, some of the stuff he's saying now is just absolutely ridiculous. And I think he's having his own version of a meltdown, because it's painfully obvious to anybody that watches the product and reads Dave's stuff that he's just flat out dead wrong about what it takes to be successful, particularly in television. Television is, whether it's wrestling, a sitcom, a dramatic series, a murder mystery, whatever it is, it's storytelling. It is storytelling. And you can tell yourself and talk about it on social media that it's not about the story, it's about the matches, or make excuses for some of the lamest stories I've ever seen on primetime wrestling. You can make all the excuses you want, but it just sucks. And the audience reflects that. They're dying.
Yeah. And you know what, when it comes to Dave, I don't think that an old expression that one of my mentors said to me when I was a young man, he said, you still don't know what you don't know. And Dave thinks he knows it all, and he still has no clue what he doesn't know. And when he rates a match, for example, or he talks about the work rate of a professional wrestler, really all he's saying, Eric, is this guy does a lot of moves that I like, because the other elements of a great wrestler never seem to enter into his conversation. It's never about how a guy registers, how a guy sells. It's never about how a guy interacts with the crowd, the moments in between the moves. It's always, this is a 6-star match. They did 500 moves. They had 36 false finishes, and it was great. But the finish of the match was not the biggest pop of the night. It was not the biggest pop of the match. There was zero psychology to the match. So immediately to me, I look at it and go, it was just a bunch of moves and it didn't mean a lot to me. But it doesn't bother me when Dave wants to give his opinion on matches. That's his opinion. But when he starts talking about the business of the industry, to which he is woefully unequipped to discuss, that's when I think, man, he should just leave that alone and leave that to people like you who are unmatched when it comes to having the experience in that realm. And I just think he's out of his depth and he wants to be all things to everyone. And he's just not.
Well, you hit it right on the head. You absolutely hit it on the head. Like Dave, and I've talked about this before, I think when it comes to the history of the industry, who wrestled who and where, how many people were in attendance, all that kind of stuff, I think he's one of the best.
Yeah.
I mean, he does spend a lot of time researching that material, and very few, if any, other people really do, at least that have a platform to discuss it. I think he's really great at that, probably unequaled in any other platform. But that's not good enough for him. He decides he wants to try to tell people what works in an industry that he's never spent 5 minutes in.
Yeah.
I mean, he's probably taken some home movies. I understand he has a family, which is hard for me to understand and believe, but it's true. I'm like, whoa. But I'm sure he's taking some home movies. He's probably taking some video when he's on vacation. But he's got zero experience in building an audience. And I think if he would stay away from it, he calls himself an analyst. He studies. He reads articles to pick up buzzwords that he can use to make himself sound smarter than he really is. That's not the same as studying. He calls himself a journalist, but he can't structure 4 sentences and not mess it up because he doesn't use any grammar and he doesn't know how to write. But he's a journalist. And just recently, he was criticizing other people in the wrestling media for not taking their job seriously. It's like, but people still, they follow him because I think, there's a segment of the wrestling fan base that is kind of, they're outcasts, they're outsiders. They're kind of like the nerds in school that nobody wanted to hang out with.
Right.
And Dave's like the glue that holds that little group of geeks together. So they defend him desperately because if he goes away, their whole geekdom is going to implode and there'll be no geek leader. And Dave is the king geek.
So to that point, I just wanted to say that, and you know what, there's going to be people in the audience go, oh, here goes Donnie talking about the time again that he booked a show with Hulk Hogan on it. Of course I'm going to talk about that. It's the coolest thing ever. But I was an indie wrestling booker, Eric, for 10, 12 years. And then I got the opportunity to book 2 separate indie tours where Hulk Hogan was on. And that was during his TNA days. You were there. You probably had something to do with brokering those deals. And he came up to Canada. We did a tour in Ontario that was only a couple shows. And then we went out to the East Coast of Canada and did a whole bunch of shows. And you know what? Up until that point, Eric, I thought I was an okay booker. And then when I'm on a tour with Hulk Hogan, Scott Steiner, Kevin Nash, the New Age Outlaws, et cetera, I realized, I don't know anything. I don't know anything. So they were sweet enough to pull me into their car and put me under their learning tree, and I was careful not to feel like, are they working me? But they didn't care. They didn't care what their spot was, who they were putting over. None of that mattered. They just
you know what? The only thing that mattered to them, is they got a great crowd reaction, because there's nothing worse than being a talent and going out there and having the crowd not react.
Yeah.
And that's worse than not getting paid in some cases. You know what I mean? So they really wanted the reaction. And the only way you get that reaction is to think through, at least loosely think through, the arc, the pacing, where things are on the card. And I'm glad to hear that they, they spend some time with you, because it gives you insight. It makes you, as your friend, your mentor told you, and I use the phrase myself often. I heard it from somebody long ago. You don't know what you don't know. And I remind myself of that anytime I start thinking I know what I'm doing, and I'm starting to get to that point of being not just confident, but overconfident, I remind myself, I still don't know what I haven't learned yet. And there's always something.
Going back now to your days as the head of World Championship Wrestling, Dave Meltzer, and I don't want, this is the last thing I'm going to discuss about Dave Meltzer, but Dave Meltzer, as you know, because Conrad Thompson brings these things up to you all the time, he would report things that sounded like they were coming from within the company. Mm-hmm. How much did it piss you off at the time to think one of my guys is feeding him information, whether it's good or bad info? And what did you say to Terry Taylor?
Terry and I spoke about 1.5 years or 2 years ago, and I'm good with Terry. Okay. We all do things when we're younger and we have less experience that we regret. And I'm no different than anybody else in that regard. So I don't hold a grudge, really. I don't hold a grudge, period. And Terry gave me a call because he probably heard me, using him as an example on my podcast. And we had a great conversation. And I understand, why people do the things they do. Sometimes it's easy to understand their motivation. And once I can understand their motivation, even though I recognize, for example, when talent, particularly in management, would use Dave Meltzer, because that's what it boils down to, by the way. It wasn't that Dave Meltzer and Terry Taylor had this great relationship. It wasn't that anybody in the industry really respects Dave. Everybody uses him because they know if they feed him something, he's going to come out. It's going to come out in the dirt sheet. A certain segment of the audience is going to read it and embrace it. In my own case, and this is one of the reasons I'm as hard as I am on Dave, when I first got to WCW in 91, as an announcer, I was a backup to the backup to the backup. I was the lowest hanging fruit on the tree when it came to announcers. I did all the stuff that Jim Ross and Tony Schiavone didn't have time to do. That was my job. Mm-hmm. And as such, I wasn't a threat to anybody, right? I was like talking potted plant. I wasn't trying to take, nobody thought I was going to take their job. Nobody was threatened by me. I wasn't a wrestler, so I wasn't going to take anybody's job in the ring. And as a result of that, there was just a lot of conversation that happened around me that I was able to absorb. And this was long before I ever thought I'd ever get into management in WCW. But after a year or two, and I started getting promoted, I got to be promoted to executive producer. There was a guy in Turner Broadcasting by the name of Jeff Carr. Now, Jeff Carr was a nice guy. He was what they call a program director, and a program director is mid-level management. Mm-hmm. A program director is basically someone who, in television at least, helps schedule the shows that senior management want in their primetime lineup or in their lineup at all, but tries to organize it, manage it, and maximize it. Jeff Carr was the only person back in 1991, 1992, 1993. This is my era when I watched what happened. Jeff Carr was the only person in Turner Broadcasting that ever watched wrestling. Nobody else, Ted included. I mean, he had other things to do, like, building empires and shit. Sorry, producer, building empires and stuff. Ted was pretty busy. No other management, the rest of the management underneath Ted didn't even want wrestling to be on Turner Broadcasting, so they never watched it. Nobody understood the business. So by default, they would go to Jeff Carr because Jeff Carr watched the product, but Jeff Carr read Dave Meltzer's dirt sheet. And because Jeff Carr didn't know any better, he didn't take the time to learn the business. He didn't spend any time in WCW talking to the people who were writing and producing the show, who were recruiting and managing talent, who were overseeing the live event schedule, who were a part of the pay-per-view business, who understood marketing. He didn't spend any time with any of those people. He sat in his little office with no windows at Turner Broadcasting in his mid-level management job, reading Dave Meltzer's dirt sheet, and by default became the wrestling expert within Turner Broadcasting. I'm not kidding you. And some of the things that, I'd hear about it in Dave Meltzer's sheet, or somebody would show me something, and a week or two later, we're getting memos from Jeff Carr reflecting the same insanity that Dave was writing about. And that's when it became very obvious to me that even though it's a dirt sheet and it's primarily, low-hanging fruit wrestling fan type mentality, there are executives who don't take the time to learn or experience for themselves, who rely on that because Dave puts himself out there as a journalist who studies the business. And people are lazy inherently. People are lazy, and they'll find a path of least resistance to gain knowledge or whatever, and they go to Dave's dirt sheet. And that affected a lot of things very, very negatively in WCW. So there's a reason that I have as much disdain for Dave Meltzer as I do. It's because what he's done to the wrestling industry over the course of the last 30 years overall is very negative. He's a parasite. He lives off of it, but he contributes nothing to it.
Let's stay on WCW for a minute and move away from Dave Meltzer. We've given him enough pub tonight. Talking about WCW, it's impossible to tell the story without talking about the NWO, right? It's impossible to tell the story of WCW without mentioning the NWO. But I think a piece that a lot of people understate, or they talk about in a separate conversation, Eric, is the fact that the NWO couldn't have survived and couldn't have worked if you didn't have that one alpha male protagonist, that one super babyface. And the fact that Bill Goldberg landed in your laps and was not only a larger than life physical specimen with all this physical charisma, but in an angle where this faction is run by a bunch of main event stars from the other company, and they're invading. You've got this homegrown guy that's wearing the colors of your company. I don't know that there's anyone, with all apologies to Ric Flair and Sting and Luger, I don't think there's anyone else that could have been as strong a protagonist against the NWO. Like, and at what, my question, I guess, is at what point from the time that Bill Goldberg started as this lime green kid taking his first bumps, at what point did you go, that's our horse?
It happened. It just happened. There was no, light bulb moment. You know what I mean? It's not like we went, whoa, we got to, it was, it started strong. The story of Bill Goldberg and how he emerged. Bill and I had a couple conversations. I really wasn't that interested in him at the time because we had so many other top talent. Yeah. I didn't feel the need to add another, top guy to the list. We had, Hogan and Savage and Flair and Sting and Luger. We're doing all right? We didn't need anybody. But Bill came along. We finally put a deal together and put him into the power plant, starting to develop him. And I immediately started getting calls from people saying, hey, this is a little different. This is not your normal power plant recruit. So everybody started paying attention to him pretty early on. And then typically what you do with somebody who's been in training and in development for a while, you want to get a look at, see how they react in front of people. Mm-hmm. You don't want to put them on television because if it doesn't go well, you don't want to expose a young talent or an inexperienced talent to a national television audience. You want to give them a chance to succeed, not set them up for failure. But at the same time, you need to see how they're going to react in front of a real crowd. So we started bringing Bill out in what we call dark matches, which are generally if the doors open at 7, for a live television production, around 5:30 or 6, you have a couple dark matches because people are starting to fill the arena. It's not full yet. They're the people that show up early. So if you're set up for a 10,000 seat arena, you may have 12 or 1,500 people there by around 5:30, 5:45. Great. Let's put this guy out there and see how he reacts in front of a live crowd. Typically, they don't pay attention. Typically, they're stuffing their face with popcorn, hot dogs, and a warm beer.
Right.
But when Bill came out, it was like, whoa, put down the popcorn. I don't want this hot dog. You have the beer. I'm checking this guy out. And you'd get a real reaction. Hardly ever happened in a dark match environment. In fact, I don't recall it ever happening before. And it was like, wow, that was crazy the first time. Yeah, but maybe it was just this crowd. Let's do it again and see what happens. Bigger reaction. Let's do it again and see what happens. Bigger reaction. So over the course of 3, 4, 5 weeks, we went, okay, this guy can only do 3 things well, but let's figure out a way to make that work. Let's camouflage what he can't do, highlight what he can do, because this guy's magic. When he walks through the curtain, people stop what they're doing and pay attention. That's a really hard thing to find. And that's where Bill came from. But I'm going to disagree with you for a second.
Okay.
I think Bill certainly was the beneficiary of just the absolute peak in WCW, as well as the wrestling business in general, because at the time Bill showed up, WCW was number 1 by a mile.
Right.
When it came to television ratings, and consistently. Sting, I think, was the perfect protagonist. Okay. He was, other than Ric Flair, he was the face of WCW to probably 90% of the WCW fan base. People that have been watching him since Ric Flair put him on the map and made him and really got him over. And then watch Sting's character progress. And the story itself set Sting up because he was betrayed by the people closest to them. He felt betrayed, which kind of was the catalyst for him to become this dark, brooding character. It wasn't just what was going on with the NWO and the fact that the NWO was running roughshod over WCW. It was the fact that Lex Luger and others, people that were close to Sting at that time, began to doubt his loyalty. And that sense of betrayal was the catalyst for Sting to go from that surfer Sting, bright, shiny, glittery babyface to this brooding, scary character that hung out with a vulture in the rafters.
Right.
It worked so well, and I don't know that anybody could have done that any better. Bill Goldberg couldn't have played that role. Those ratings from 97 all the way through 98, whenever that started, it was like a year and a half angle. And it didn't end well. My bad. I screwed that up. And I had help. But if you look at that story from beginning to middle and an end over the course of the 14, 16, 18 months that we developed it, every week it got more and more and more and more momentum. I don't think Bill could have pulled that off because he didn't have the backstory and the loyalty of the fan base that Sting had to make it work.
That's fair. Do you think that ultimately Bill could have been more successful and there may have been more opportunity to develop a backstory for him if there wasn't so much thrust on his win-loss record? Because it felt like as soon as he lost, a lot of the shine was off that new toy. Well,
yes. Good point. The answer is yes. But the reason it's yes is because Bill was able to go for so long and ascend to such a great position and be so successful without ever having to learn. The minute he became a hot commodity, he wasn't going to the power plant anymore. He wasn't working on his repertoire. He wasn't adding any tools to his toolbox so that when that win streak was over, he could then take that next level, that next step, and engage in matches that would require much more storytelling within the body of the match than going out, inhaling a bunch of fire and smoke, getting into the ring and destroying somebody in 3 minutes. That goes back to what he was good at. He learned 3 things in a power plant. He was great at those. He knew nothing else once he was more experienced and he had more confidence, but he didn't have any tools in his tool chest that would allow him to go out and have the kind of match, for example, that everybody wishes he would have had with Bret Hart, especially Bret Hart. He wasn't capable of going out there and having a 20-minute match with anybody because he was only capable of doing 3 things.
Right.